Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears made one minor salary cap adjustment to one contract to get under the cap to start the 2021 season, and it sent Bears fans in a tizzy as a greater reflection of the state of this team's financial health in 2021 and moving forward. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group, and make sure that you subscribe to the Locked On Bears YouTube channel so you're keeping up with all of our video podcasts as well. On the show today, a look at Jimmy Graham's contract, the Bears restructuring, and the state of the Bears salary cap health as a whole. We'll discuss why Bears fans kind of got fired up and maybe rehashed some old disgruntled spots with general manager Ryan Pace. We'll touch on the state of the salary cap moving forward into 2022 and some other moves on the horizon the Bears might want to be thinking about. And then we'll find kind of a silver lining here, a path forward financially, and where the Bears can still find some wiggle room and start building around Justin Fields next year and beyond. Let's start with the news of the day. The Bears officially restructuring Jimmy Graham's contract. They take a portion of his salary for this season and essentially convert it into a bonus that allows them to push it off into the future, spreading it out over multiple years on the remainder of the contract, which has varying effects. But calling from our friend Brad Spielberger, friend of the show at PFF Brad on Twitter, it essentially will move, I think, just over $4.66 million in salary cap space into 2022. The problem being that if Jimmy Graham retires next offseason, then all of that salary cap instantly hits in 2022, as opposed to the Bears trying to spread it out over multiple years in the future, depending on if they're able to work out some kind of, contract extension with him. If he wants to keep playing, then potentially they can spread out that $4 million across the board a little bit longer. But instead, for now, we're anticipating it. At least you have to plan for 4.5 plus added to the dead salary cap money for 2022, but clearing up some of that space right now, because before the Jimmy Graham move, the Bears were sitting, depending on where you get your numbers, almost around $1 million over the cap to start this regular season. And so they had to make some kind of move to get down. And you're wondering, well, how did they get through the offseason over the cap and not? Well, what happens is then when you sign guys like Jason Peters, then you put guys in injured reserve and sign more guys to your 53-man roster, right? You have sort of players moving in and out to where some guys stay on the books and then come off the books, and as different salary escalators kind of kick in. And so the NFL says, all right, here's sort of another deadline to where you need to be back down, because it's sort of hypothetical future projections for salary until the league starts the regular season, like with the 53-man roster cut down days. It's a little bit complicated to get to the minutia of how the Bears were allowed to be over the cap, but just understand they were really hovering around that salary cap number. And so the Graham restructuring clears about $4 million, but they were $1 million over. So now they're like $3.7 million under the salary cap. And as our friend Brad Spielberger had explained on Twitter, that it creates some breathing room for signing guys to your 53-man roster and the signing bonuses that might come with there, paying guys in injured reserve, playing your practice squad players, etc. And so what it does is it pushes that salary cap into next year, and the Bears will still be paying Jimmy Graham next year, whether he's on the roster or not. And it's a move that the Bears have done. Now they're paying Kyle Fuller dead money that he's not on the roster. They're paying Charles Leno dead money, even though he's not on the roster. The Bears are actually still paying Trey Burton, the tight end, on their salary cap this year. He is still costing them money because they pushed his guaranteed money into the future and asked to pay it off later, as opposed to having to have paid it up front at whatever time that money was owed, to create more room to create more moves at that time. And that's the problem with where we've seen these Bears salary cap issues go, is that you start to have to pay for it eventually. And when you push Jimmy Graham into next year, you could have had Graham off the books after this year. He was doing like a $10 million cap hit this year. Instead, they bring that down and choose to pay it more next year. But you've got other money that you also have to pay next year. And it becomes this question of, when are the chickens going to come to roost? And it's really starting to look like 2022 is a potential problem year for the Bears financially, depending on what they ultimately decide to do. Because even before, you get too far ahead of ourselves, the Bears right now, just after the Jimmy Graham move, are fifth in highest amount of dead cap next offseason in money that they're paying to players that aren't on the team anymore. If you account sort of Jimmy Graham in there, right now the number is 16 million, which is it's not horrible on its own. In a vacuum, 16 million dead cap it's a lot. It is the fifth most in the NFL for a reason, but the Saints are at 43, the Eagles are at 34, the Falcons at 20, and the Vikings at just under 18. So that's courtesy of our friend, again, Brad Spielberger, friend of the show, PFF_Brad on Twitter. Please follow him if you have not, because he is the salary cap expert by all means. 16 million on its own for the Bears next season is not great. And especially when you feel like, Jimmy Graham's not necessarily giving you $10 million worth of production on his own this season and paying that next year when he's not there. He's certainly not going to be giving you that production then, that he's at the tail end of his career and everyone's kind of ready for Cole Kmet to take over, and Graham will be much less necessary, assuming Kmet plays at a high level. But I think the concern is not so much, well, right now it's at $16 million, but it's at $16 million before the Bears get to next offseason, when they may have other players that they want to move on from and will then potentially owe dead money to kind of get out from a contract or two that maybe they're not super thrilled with the production that they're getting or how things are kind of playing out. There's two guys in particular that we'll break down, Robert Quinn and Nick Foles, and how that might impact the Bears 2022 salary cap and beyond, next on Locked On Bears. It's that time of year again with regular season football literally just around the corner, and BetOnline.ag is going to be your number one spot for all of the pro and college football action this season. Get all the updated odds, prop bets, and contests, including online's largest $500,000 NFL mega contest and the world's largest $200,000 NFL survivor contest, open now at betonline.ag. Plus, they have an opening day super promo. If you place a bet on what will be tomorrow's season opening game, Thursday, September 9th, between the Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Dallas Cowboys, if your bet loses, betonline.ag will refund your wager up to $25. You just have to enter the promo code NFL100 when you sign up. And that promo code is particularly important because if you enter the NFL 100 promo code, you will also get a free 100% welcome bonus, matching your first deposit, giving you double the money to play with at betonline.ag, your online sportsbook experts. I wouldn't say $16 million of dead cap space in 2022 is a good place to be. But, as we saw with the Saints and some of those other teams, it can be worse. But the fear is that it's most likely going to be worse for the Bears next offseason because of a couple of contracts in particular. Foles and Robert Quinn really stand out as two guys that, well, one more likely than other to really not be in the cards for 2022. And so when you start to have to take out their numbers in addition to everything else, it gets a little bit hairy. And again, I'm consulting with our friend Brad Spielberger, the salary cap expert, big time friend of the show, and really a super valuable asset to Bears fans and NFL fans across the board. The potential of cutting Nick Foles and Robert Quinn could push the Bears up, could literally double the projected dead money that this roster would be dealing with, because you take off Nick Foles, and that's going to be almost $8 million of dead cap coming into next year. I believe it's 7.666 is how much dead cap you would be erasing if you cut Nick Foles just this off season. Then you take in Robert Quinn, who's going to be owed $16 million next season. If you cut him, it would be $9.3 million in dead cap space. So you kind of add those to the 16, and that puts you to $33 million in dead cap space. Now, cutting both those guys will also save you some on your current cap as well. I think Robert Quinn, you'll save 6.7, but still have to pay him 9.3 to not have him on the roster anymore. Whereas I think with Nick Foles, you would save $3 million, but then still be paying him 7.5 to kind of keep things going beyond, to shed him from the roster, but you still have to pay him the guaranteed money that you're owed him. And so that really bumps you back up toward the top of this group of having to pay potential guys here that are not going to be a part of your team, or you might not want to be a part of your team. Robert Quinn might not be worth $16 million if he has another bad season. Nick Foles almost certainly not going to keep him around as a third string quarterback again. I mean, maybe he could be Justin Fields' backup, but he'd still be a $10 million backup quarterback. Doesn't really make a lot of financial sense to keep him. Maybe we're on the path to keeping Robert Quinn. That's maybe a different argument for a different day, but it's concerning there when you start to add up on who might be here and who might not. And maybe the Bears could alleviate some of that by designating them a post-June 1st cut, which would then push some of that salary cap even farther into the future. But you still eventually are having to pay for this, and it's only going to cut down some of that immediate 2022 salary cap impact. But then you start to go another layer further here as another name that Brad Spielberger threw out there as a potential cut to add to it again. Danny Trevathan. The Bears keep pushing that money back more and more. They've got 3 void years on the end of his contract as well, and we're already seeing him start this season on injured reserve. They're going with Alec Ogletree for at least the first 4 weeks. Trevathan has really had a lot of trouble staying healthy throughout his career. This is the beginning of the season, just trying to recover from last season. He hasn't been really ready to go, and you just wonder how much longer Trevathan is going to be in the cards as the Bears starting linebacker. And of course, then he is owed in 2022. If he's owed $6 million this next year and then 6.5 the following year. And so if you cut him, you're going to have to essentially pay both of those. I believe you're able to spread it out over the 2 years because it's spread out already over 2 years, but it's adding another, I think, $9-ish million in the first year and another $6-ish million in the second year. And it becomes a very big boost to push it again from what started right now is $16 million in dead cap space. If you add Foles and Quinn, that puts you to 33. And if you add Danny Trevathan, that puts you to $42 million in dead cap space. $42 million you're not paying any players on your 53-man roster. I mean, I don't know that maybe Patrick Mahomes is getting about $40 million a year, but that's about the equivalent, right, of how much money you would be paying players to not pay for your team. And as Brad Spielberger had pointed out, that's over 20% of the salary cap next year. We don't know what the salary cap exactly is going to be in 2022, but the projected maximum that it could be is like $208 million. And so if you're paying 42 to players that aren't there, that's 1/5 of your salary cap space. If you were to cut Foles, Quinn, and Trevathan. Now, maybe you keep Robert Quinn at $16 million, even though, I mean, we'll see what this season brings, but Bears fans haven't been super thrilled with what he's been able to do. Maybe you keep Danny Trevathan and bring it back one more year, but there's some pros and cons, I think, in both directions there. And you start to look around the NFL a little bit as far as those other teams paying big time money to dead cap space, and it almost always strongly correlates with not success. I was going to say failure, I guess, but low win totals. There's a tweet from Warren Sharp that this was from earlier in the offseason. He was specifically looking at the Detroit Lions, but it's the record of teams with a dead cap of 40 or more in the last 10 years. And he went through a bunch of different years. In 2020, teams that had dead cap of 40 or more, the Panthers won 5 games, the Jets won 2 games, the Jaguars won 1 game. Before it was 5 wins, 4 wins, 5 wins, 6 wins, 5 wins, 3 wins. You're not seeing teams with $40 million in dead cap space make the playoffs. It's just it's a sign of a team in a bad financial situation. And then because they don't have so much dead cap space, they can't then afford to pay really good players. It's part of why the Lions have nobody starting at wide receiver, and it's kind of a mess of a team that everyone expects to really be bad. And some of those other teams, the Jets last year, the Jaguars last year, couple years before that, the Dolphins when they were sort of tanking for Tua, and the Giants before they got Daniel Jones, and the Cardinals, I think, before they got Kyler Murray. All these teams end up really sort of finishing poorly in the NFL standings here because they end up dumping so much money just in dead salary cap space. And so it's just becomes a result of, what do they say? Hens laying to rest, the roosters laying to rest. I can't remember the chicken phrase, the cliche right away, but this is the result of, giving players bad contracts, cutting players from those bad contracts, and having to pay that guaranteed money somewhere along the line. It does, you can't keep pushing it back forever, and it just builds and builds and builds until you start to have to pay that check. And it's contracts that Ryan Pace has signed himself. It's not guys he traded for with bad contracts. It's not contracts he inherited as general manager that he's still trying to get out of. It's players he's prioritized in free agency and signed, and then now having to pay for them and perhaps cut them before you would have wanted to because moves haven't worked out. And that's where so much of the Bears fan frustration has come following these moves. There's been a lot of that feeling of like Pace has done some mistakes in free agency and in contracts that are now hurting this team potentially, and potentially hurting Justin Fields as well. That's sort of the big concern, is like how this affects the team long term. But we'll turn and try and find some silver linings there and a little bit more of a financial path forward, and find a way that we can try and make this work financially next on Locked On Bears. I know there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to salary cap moves and dead cap and void years and all that, but I'll tell you what, nobody knows more about moving parts than our friends at rockauto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. They got everything you could possibly need for your vehicle: engine control modules, fuel pump assemblies, to easier stuff like tail lamps, motor oil, even just new carpets. If your vehicle needs it, they've got it at rockauto.com. And I love just how easy it is to navigate that massive catalog. All you do is enter in your car's make and model, and then it pulls up all the different parts available for your vehicle. And you can sort between the brands, the specifications, and most importantly, the prices that you prefer. Those prices really stand out to me because a lot of like the chain part stores in your town, they'll have a different price tier if you're a professional mechanic versus a do-it-yourselfer like us. But rockauto.com's prices are the same for everybody. So don't spend up to twice as much for the same part somewhere else. Head on over to rockauto.com and see everything available for your car or truck. When you check out, fill out their box. It says, "How did you hear about us?" and write the words "Locked On." That way they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Does this sound familiar to you? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows while you're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you also have your neighbor's best friend's password for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without the hassle, and to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part is there's no annual contract. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. So to some extent, the Bears are going to have to eat some money in 2022. The $16 million is already there after the Graham move, and you've got Charles Leno's money kind of spread out as a post-June 1st move, and other void year contracts sort of coming to pay in 2022. That's just part of it. You can control how much worse it goes from there with Foles, with Quinn, with Trevathan, but but there's potential salary cap savings in addition to dead cap with some of those guys. So you sort of pick your poison in that regard. But it feels like we're kind of in like one of those financial shows where we're trying to help the Bears pay down their debt, right? You have a debt problem, and we're gonna walk you through how to really sort of go through this. So first and foremost, the salary cap is projected to keep going up. There was the 1 year where it didn't, and that threw everything off, but it's projected to increase again. And so as that goes each year, it should become easier if you stick with smart financial moves. Essentially, like the amount of your income in this case is going to go up. So as long as you don't keep adding to your debt at the same pace, your debt as a team, debt as in dead salary cap money in this metaphor, should keep coming down. And so I think for 2022, for next offseason, assuming it's Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy, although whoever is going to be the general manager in that case, you have to really be careful about how you're structuring your long-term contract, because there's such a fine line to walk there in terms of where you put the guaranteed money, because that's all that gets saved as dead cap is guaranteed money. Your base salary that he's just paid game-to-game paycheck, that's only paid out during the season. If you cut a player before they've earned it, they don't get that money, and it's free cap space. And so, of course, players want as much guaranteed money as they can get, and you want to if you want to get the best free agents, you're going to have to pay them guaranteed money. But what you have to do then, if you have a lot of dead cap in 2022, is still backload contracts, but just be very careful about how you backload contracts. Like, for example, if you're short on salary cap space, you can sign Allen Robinson to a contract extension. If he's seeking the, $18-20 million a year, you might not be able to really afford to give him $18 or $20 million in 2022, but you might be able to more so in 23, 24, and 25. So you bring that year one salary cap hit down a lot cheaper, and then load some of the rest of the money in year 2 and year 3, fully guarantee that first year, fully guarantee maybe even that second and third year, because you're going to get quality out of Robinson for those 3 years, but make sure you're not pushing things far beyond that into years 4 and 5, because that's where you get in trouble. These players don't tend to play out the full length of their contract when they sign to a big deal. That's like with Robert Quinn. Bears signed him to a 5-year deal. Typically, then you're not going to play all 5 of those years, but because the Bears have sort of spread some of the salary, the guaranteed salary out on that, it becomes a challenge when you have to cut him very early in this contract. It would still be a challenge after 2 years for somebody like Allen Robinson. You'd like to think you're going to sign players for 2 years, more than 2 years, or play them for more than 2 years on a 5-year contract. And the bigger lesson here is to just sign better players. I mean, easier said than done, but right. I mean, that's first and foremost. Make sure if you're going to sign someone long-term that you really know what you're going to get out of them long-term, because you don't want to get in the same, you can't repeat the same trouble again with Robert Quinn and Jimmy Graham and the same kind of things they did by pushing that money in the future and still signing them to still not getting that full use out of their contract because they weren't good enough players. And I think it's going to end up, as you push some of that money back, because you're going to be low in cap space in 2022, you may end up paying them more in 23 and beyond than you'd want to, but this is sort of the price you end up paying for paying down that. You have to pay down the debt in year one, and then when that dead cap is sort of paid, then you'll have more money in the previous years to match that higher salary that you're slightly pushing back more into the future. I think the real challenge here for next offseason becomes when you try and sign guys to these 1-year deals, because you can't spread a 1-year deal over multiple years, or else it becomes a multi-year deal. But you want the flexibility of just signing to a guy to a 1-year deal. So, right, that's where it becomes tricky. Is, Andy Dalton signed a 1-year, $12 million deal. You have to have $12 million right now to sign Andy Dalton. That cap space has to be here and now and present, and you can't share that over the future and, push that around. And so that's where it becomes challenging to sign those sort of value veteran players that might be cheaper, as opposed to the big name long-term contract guys that at least give you some flexibility if you're going to be smart about it. And that's why I think you have to be a team that builds through the draft. That's what's so important about this, is that you get young players on long-term contracts that are cheap. You have guys that like James Daniels has been a starting guard for 3 or 4 years now, /center on a cheap contract, and you've been able to squeeze that out. Tariq Cohen, a cheap running back. David Montgomery, cheap running back. Cole Kmet, cheap tight end. Darnell Mooney, cheap wide receiver. And that's why you build through the draft, because those guys end up being easy contracts to work with, inexpensive. They give you more money to sign more free agents. And it comes back to some of that Bears fan frustration with Ryan Pace, feeling like they haven't done a good enough job building through the draft. When you move on from guys like Anthony Miller and Riley Ridley after 3 or 4 seasons of trying them out at wide receiver and ultimately not having that success. There have been gems; those have been very valuable, and it's not as though Ryan Pace has not made any good signings or any good free or any good draft picks. It's just that's sort of the source of Bears fans really, like, with Jimmy Graham being the source of like this rehashing of some of those same frustrations, because it's another example of where missed free agents and missed draft picks have come to hurt the Bears in terms of their ability to sign players and build around Justin Fields. Because at the end of the day, that's what the whole direction of the franchise became about. What is it, 4 months ago in the NFL draft? When Justin Fields came into this organization, your whole philosophy changes. It's like having a kid, right? Everything changes and becomes about that kid for the team. And every other plans that you had in the short and the long term, kind of all of a sudden it's Justin Fields. And that's exactly what this franchise needs to be focused on. And so if you're spending $16 to $30 to $40 million on dead cap space, that's $40 million you can't spend to give Justin Fields a better offensive line, better receivers, a better running game, better defense, better support all the way around. And so you're left sort of having to hope and try and be confident in Justin Fields being good enough to really overcome that and to elevate the level of play of players around him to make up for potentially lesser talent as a result of having less cap space from more dead cap from bad contracts that you've had in the past and from not having been able to replace those contracts with younger developed rookies and guys on rookie contracts coming up through your organization. At least there's the advantage that they're not paying Justin Fields top quarterback money. It would be a lot harder if you had to be paying Fields right now, 25, 30 million in addition to the 25, 30 million of dead cap space, right? You're saving some money there that helps you absorb this dead cap in 2022, but you need to have that freed up in 2023 and beyond and really kind of maximize this window while Justin Fields is still cheap and really entering his prime and getting better and better as a quarterback as he develops through these first couple of seasons. So it's the kind of thing where you can't put him in this tough spot every single year. Maybe you can do it this year and a little bit next year and try and sort of patch things up and rebuild a little bit on the fly, but you can't waste it, right? You can't have some special opportunity here potentially at quarterback to do something that maybe the Bears haven't had in decades if Justin Fields can be everything they want him to be. And you can't you can't waste it all with not having enough salary cap space to put players around him because you're paying dead cap and all those other financial constraints that the Bears have put on themselves by constantly pushing that dead money in the future. That's where the frustration came from for Bears fans with the Jimmy Graham contract. It kind of all unravels from there. The Graham move in and of itself, maybe it's small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. Another $4 million here doesn't make a big difference, but it's in the context of free agent signings, other potential dead cap moves, and the long-term team building implications that kind of have Bears fans frustrated. All that frustration can go away if Justin Fields comes on the field, is great, and leads the Bears to wins in spite of all that. We'll certainly be paying a close eye to how this team performs, whether Robert Quinn does enough to save his job, whether Jimmy Graham plays well enough to justify his salary, and so much more right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you subscribe to make sure you're keeping up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We'll be back, I believe, on tomorrow's podcast. We will be joined by Sosa Kremenjas from Locked On Rams, helping us preview this Bears-Rams matchup. It's crossover Thursday every week, every Thursday on the Locked On Podcast Network. We'll be joined by our fellow Locked On hosts for the Bears opponent each week. And so tomorrow it's Locked On Rams. We'll get to know what they're doing with Matthew Stafford, how Sean McVay is approaching everything, what their defense is lined up, and how Aaron Donald might try and wreck this Bears game plan. So plenty more goodies coming your way. I hope you'll keep following along. I hope you're subscribed. However you're listening to this podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you click that subscribe button to keep up with all the videos coming out on our channels. Appreciate all the comments, all the likes, all the tweets, all the support. I hope the podcast has been able to support you throughout this offseason and get you ready for the regular season. And then as a result, more than anything else, I think now more than ever, we're definitely ready to bear down.